Excellent. So go ahead and start. Great to have everyone here today. Really excited about today's session. I'm Darren Isom, a partner in Bridgepen's San Francisco office. As many of you know, true to my New Orleans Jesuit upbringing, I love to start every event with a bit of an invocation. And today's no different. I'll start with The Trough by Judy Brown. So there's a trough in waves, a low spot where horizon disappears and only sky and water are our company. And there we lose our way unless we rest, knowing the wave will bring us to its crest again. There we may drown if we let fear hold us in its grip and shake us side to side and leave us flailing, torn, disoriented. But if we rest there, in the trough, in silence, being in the low part of the wave, keeping our energy and noticing the shape of things, the flow, then time alone will bring us to another place where we can see horizon, see land again, regain our sense of where we are and where we need to swim together. So really excited to have everyone here today for this session on making the case to Endow Black-Led Nonprofits. Just a quick start, would love to just give you a little intro on Bridgepen and who we are and what we do. Once again, I'm Darren Isom, a partner in Bridgepen's San Francisco office. I lead a lot of our work in equitable philanthropy. I joke that my job is to make sure that's not an oxymoron. The Bridgepen Group is a global nonprofit organization that collaborates with mission-driven leaders, organizations, and philanthropists to make the world more equitable and just. And we do that through quite a compendium of services. They include really developing and sharing insights, and we talk with you through that work today. Leadership development, nonprofit and NGO, strategy consulting, and then finally philanthropic consulting. And so we're putting on all of our hats today as we share the piece of the work that we're doing. I'm going to be talking with William Foster, get a chance to introduce himself in just a little bit, but giving just a little bit more about the work that we do, sharing research, insights, and practical tools. This is all part of our theory of change. This is all part of how we use our positionality to advance equitable thinking and support best practices within the field. And that work includes over 200 plus major articles and reports, 1,000 plus short pieces and tools. Really, over the last 20 years, we've become a leading producer of high quality social sector content. The latest of which, of course, was shameless self-plug, William, for my podcast, Streaming in Color, where we interview leaders of color, get their perspective on what leadership looks like and what makes it all important from a work perspective, and how do we embrace that leadership from a success perspective as well. Today, we'll get to talk with you through an interesting format for consultants. We won't use too many slides. We'll have a Q&A between William and I, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience itself towards the end. We encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A box as opposed to in the chat. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to you, William. Would love, as the first question, to have you offer just a bit of the origin story for this piece and share how it builds on your Big Bets work and our overall firm commitment to building a more equitable sector.
Great. Thank you, Darren. It's wonderful to be here with Upswell. And Darren, I very much appreciate the shameless plug for your podcast, which is excellent. My name is William Foster. I'm the managing partner at Bridgespan. I'm a frequent collaborator with Darren. He and I have teamed up on client work, on knowledge work, and particularly excited about this piece on endowing Black-led nonprofits that we teamed up on. And there's really two themes or threads, if you will, to the origin story here. And the second one, in fact, has to do with Upswell. But the first is just work that we had been doing for years on big bets, on philanthropy giving sizable, differentiatedly large gifts of support to nonprofit organizations, and some of the barriers that we saw. And what was, in some sense most curious, if you will, about our work, for years on that was the sense of almost ships passing through the night, that donors that we talked to expressed, and we believe sincerely expressed, this desire to give much more money away to the most promising nonprofit organizations, and to give away large portions of their wealth, think the Giving Pledge. And yet there wasn't that much money moving, or not nearly as much as would be implied by the desires. And at the same time, nonprofits doing incredible work, feeling like it was just, impossible to get the kind of size of support that was needed to make the difference on the kind of tough issues that they were working on. And, one particular moment that sticks in my head, we were working with a donor and had worked a long, long time to craft a $5 million gift, a very sizable gift to a social service organization. And it took a number of months to work it out into a really great gift. And at the same time, the donor was solicited for a 25th anniversary gift from his alma mater, and gave a gift of multiples the size of the one to the social service organization in a matter of days, or maybe it was weeks. But just this disparity. And one of the things that came out of that for us was the sense of endowments as potentially an underused vehicle. So endowments are the dominant form of giving to universities, to major cultural institutions, to major medical research organizations. Think about buildings that are named after people, or chairs for professors. These are things where there's a large gift where the money is drawn down in perpetuity. But our research showed that fewer than 5% of big bets to social change nonprofits were endowments, right? So predominant gift in one area, not at all in the other. And yet one of the barriers to donors giving more money to kind of scrappy organizations, to nonprofits doing the hard work of change on the ground, was this sense that they couldn't absorb a ton of money. But, the basic math is that, maybe there's a nonprofit that can't spend, $5 million over 2 or 3 years based on them, being too small. But gosh, 5 million would throw off $250,000 a year forever. Just think about how many nonprofits could be stronger and more stable and more enduring with a predictable revenue stream like that. So the one thought of this was really just the math. And it was about our work on big bets, our work on social change nonprofits, and all of those disparities that I mentioned were more exaggerated for organizations led by people of color, particularly Black-led nonprofits, where, in this research, Darren, which we can get into later, we did some fleshing out. The second stream of the origin, which is about Upswell and about my colleague Darren, was that exactly 3 years ago at the Upswell conference, and in fact, Darren, this was just before you returned to Bridgespan, Upswell hosted an event on endowing Black-led organizations, or maybe it was a slightly broader topic on sort of the economic strengthening of Black-led nonprofits, but the topic of endowments came up. And literally, while I was doing this big bets work and funding model work and looking at sort of disparities between social change nonprofits and big institutions, I joined an Upswell panel and listened to Darren facilitate a phenomenal conversation with some incredible leaders, and there was birthed this collaboration where we put 2 and 2 together to do this work. So Darren, that's the origin story, and I like to think of this as endowments are this tool that's been around for philanthropy and nonprofits forever, hundreds of years. It's sort of the most boring, stodgy tool there is, and yet when we think about using it to power Black-led organizations, social change organizations, it becomes this sort of radical tool for power shifting. So I like to think of this as a stodgy tool for radical purposes. And Darren, I would love to now turn the table back to you and ask a little bit, thinking back to before that panel at Upswell 3 years ago and before we started teaming on this work, what first intrigued you about the possibility of endowments as a vehicle for social change?
Of course, William. And once again, thanks again for pointing that out. I joked that memory showed up in Facebook 3 years ago today, a picture from that panel. So definitely, truthfully, it was exactly 3 years ago that panel happened. A lot of that work, and I love the stodgy tool that you mentioned from a radical change perspective. One of my favorite, as you know, Olivia Butler is one of my favorite writers, and one of my favorite quotes by her is, "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And so much of the work that we do is about really thinking about what do we use that we know is tried and true and proven, but with a different context becomes really radical, with a small r there, right? Like it's pretty straightforward and low-hanging fruit from a success perspective. And for me, as I thought about my work in Memphis, I left Bridgespan, some 8 years ago, I guess now, and spent some 5 years in Memphis running a philanthropic institution, the Memphis Music Initiative. And what was interesting about that work is that I had the amazing opportunity of having a fairly large sum of money from a funder. And that funding gave me an opportunity to really think about what success would look like and to really own the strategy and the thinking and put into work a lot of activities that normally I would have to play what I call the strategic telephone game, with the funder where you're trying to go back and forth to make sure your strategy is working. And so all that to say is I saw how in many ways having access to capital, things that we know, pretty straightforward techniques, really give you some degree of strategic freedom, but also actually allows you as a leader to enact a lot of the things that communities are saying are the answers. So it gives you an opportunity to really unlock what I call BIPOC genius. It really allows you to live into proximity as expertise and put forth that work and that thinking. And so as we're thinking about the success of that work coming, out of my time in Memphis, is really think about how to sustain that work, recognizing that that work requires sustaining. As I joke all the time, oppression in America is quite clever, right? You don't really solve for something and then it's done. You have to be really thoughtful about how do you put in place institutions that can carry out the work and can change and shift as the work changes and shifts. And ultimately, endowments just became a great way of thinking about how do you make sure those organizations have access to the capital they need to carry out the work. And as you noted, it's not something that's thought about very often with Black-led organizations, social change organizations, which is highly problematic on so many levels. And so it was really interesting seeing how when you brought up the idea of an endowment, it almost was jarring for folks. It was just so out of context. It was such a straightforward asking about the work itself, and particularly given the size of many of the institutions, the endowment size didn't have to be that big actually to carry out the work from a thinking perspective. So it became, from a liberatory philanthropy perspective, a way of really setting up organizations in a way that encouraged them and allowed them to carry out the work in a meaningful way over time and in a powerful way as well. I think, as you said in an earlier slide as well, it became a way of really just changing what power looked like and who had power, right? That access to funding meant that the leader wasn't constantly out searching for funding, wasn't constantly out proving themselves to funders. They were actually able to embrace the community and embrace community change in a way that brought about answers and solutions. So that for me was kind of, in many ways, the first time that idea of an endowment really stuck as an obvious answer. And it's been really fun, having these conversations and promoting others to think about this work as well. And William, with that, I have a question for you as well. I would love, you started talking about a few of these already, and I think we have a slide for this even as well. As you think about deploying endowments, what are some common misconceptions that folks face as they think about this? Come off mute for us, William.
We have this slide with the three I'll talk about in just a second, but really there is this sense that there are some barriers, right? And with philanthropists, as I said before, the desire to give away wealth in ways that are powerful is sincere, and there's just this gap between action on the ground and both stated and we believe intended desire. And it shows up particularly on this endowment question in this incredibly somewhat bizarre way, really, right? Like people just write these endowment checks to other established institutions and have these barriers for doing it. And as we've talked to individual philanthropists, as we've looked at sort of the track record of giving, these three barriers, each of which is a myth, come up most commonly. So the first is that organizations don't have the capacity to absorb a large gift, right? A lot of the ways that there's this sort of self-fulfilling cycle that kind of perpetuates have and have not a little bit in the normal ways philanthropists think about what to give. And one of the most common ways, which won't be surprising to folks in this conversation, is a donor will look and see what's the largest gift an organization has ever received, or where would our gift be, amongst the gifts currently being solicited. And it's very natural not to want to do something that's 2 or 3 or 4 times the size of what's ever been received. And so part of it is not wanting to stand out in that way. And the other part, as I mentioned before, is this question of, let's say an organization has a $500,000 a year annual budget. How much would there be a distortion if all of a sudden their budget was $2 million a year? And how much risk would there be to going off a cliff, right? That's a sort of a financial cliff. That's a common, concern. And this is where endowments really are somewhat magical, where it flips the question from how much can a nonprofit absorb to how much can we give. So if a nonprofit has $500,000 a year budget and could operate in really powerful and responsible ways at $1 million a year, then to generate $500,000 a year in recurring revenue, you typically need $10 million gift. And so all of a sudden, instead of saying, can we give a 3-year grant of $500,000 a year for 1.5 total, 10 million is what you would give. And it just completely changes the envelope, and of course eliminates the whole risk of going off a cliff, because the money is solid forever. So the first myth is like, what's the absorptive capacity? And and Darren and I have done some dreaming on this, but really enormous amounts of philanthropy could come off the sidelines to trusted community organizations working on things with this model. And we'll get to some sort of rules or guidelines of how much from a nonprofit perspective is a healthy amount to have in your financial model. The second myth is who can manage the money better. We have heard from individual philanthropists the thought, well, gosh, I do want to keep supporting them in perpetuity, but our philanthropy, our investment team is much more sophisticated at money management, and we would be able to manage the money better, and we can just write the check each year. And that's and that leads to endowments not being given that otherwise would. And there's really sort of two elements of this myth. One is that that the money management is sort of a scarce skill or service. And we live in a very highly developed financial system where it's actually quite easy to secure money management services. And so nonprofits don't have to build their own money management team. There's all kinds of places, from community foundations to to other places where the money can be given. In fact, there are even legal vehicles to allow the donor's own team to keep managing it, but have the money, the asset itself, transferred. And the second is I guess the psychological myth of it, Darren, that like actually you would keep giving forever. I mean, Darren, you explained, I think, quite beautifully the dynamic of the nonprofit leader constantly trying to keep the donor engaged, because there's always this risk the money won't be given. And we haven't seen donors say, look, we're going to keep the money managed here, but we will give you X dollars a year forever, no questions asked. I mean, there's always the sort of renewal and the review of performance, and that risk is what fundamentally distorts behavior and keeps power in the places it's fixed as it stands. And then the third myth is this question of nonprofits working themselves out of business. I mean, there's probably no one in this conversation that wouldn't love to work themselves out of business, right? Like, would that we could take an intractable social problem, whether it's a public health problem or an economic mobility problem, and truly solve it. And of course, civil society is filled with examples of tremendous progress. Yet, as Darren said, whether it's racism or other social ills, they are intractable, ever-evolving challenges. And on most issues, there are decades of work to do, and developing strong institutions that can have the endurance to work on them year in and year out. Poverty, democracy, public health, education. I don't really think that any of us believe that that's the kind of work that in a 5-year sort of strategy plan gets solved. Hopefully there can be huge strides, but things don't get solved. And there are lots of examples in all of these fields of work, from civil rights to youth engagement, where there are just critical community pillars that do work year in and year out in a somewhat unpredictable, scrappy way that would be more powerful. So just like a university will educate children 20 years from now, or students, we are blessed with a rich palette of nonprofit organizations that have important work to do for decades. And And so that's a little bit of a distraction, that third myth, Darren. So so those are the myths. And I guess I would love to now flip it back to you, Darren, to take this a little bit more from, we've talked about philanthropists some here, but a little bit more from the nonprofit leaders' vantage point. From the perspective of a social change leader, from what are the things that a CEO, leadership team of a nonprofit should be thinking about asking donors for, or how to tee up the conversation about an endowment?
Got it. Yes, and definitely want to jump to that and think about kind of what are some successful conversations with funders. I do want, and please leave this slide up, but I do want to talk just a little bit as well about many things that were really, important to me, or what I thought stood out about the work and the thinking as we were jumping in. And one, I think that, was really interesting for me to note how when you talked about numbers and you talk about endowments, one, just the imbalance of numbers, right? And I joke all the time that as Americans, we struggle with numbers. And so this is the difference between $1 million and $1 billion, right? And so when I saw, as we were doing the work and thinking about what endowments might look like, we saw organizations, universities even, were one of the few examples of places where endowments were happening. Places like Harvard, for example, their endowment is $53 billion, right? $1 billion is 1,000 millions. Harvard has 53,000 millions, right? Same with the Yale at 42,000 millions, right? From a number perspective. I went to Howard. Howard's endowment is closer to 800 million, right? Harvard has 53,000 millions. Howard has 800 million, right? And so that number there was really glaring. But even more shocking is if you look at a school, a modest endowment, if you will, for a historically white institution like Amherst, small liberal arts college, 3.8 billion. So you get the sense of numbers, some 3,000 millions. Their endowment at Amherst was bigger than Howard, Spelman, and all 107 HBCU endowments combined, that one school, right? And so for me, it was just really jarring, the level of disconnect that happened from a financial perspective, and almost how the best of intentions were creating ongoing problems that almost seemed insolvable to some degree as well, right? And so really thinking about those funding amounts, and where was there an opportunity to really unleash funding in a way that made a lot of sense. And to your point, I also want to come back, William, to this whole idea of, I think this one of the myths that can be really problematic in a way that can be self-defeating, this one that nonprofits should be around to put themselves out of business, right? Ultimately, like, the problem should be solved. We have some great solutions. We're going to solve this problem in 5 years, right? And I think it's perfectly fair to say that if a problem took 200 years to create, it may take at least 100 to fix, right? And so how do we have institutions that can have the wherewithal to survive those various issues? All that to say, I think there are just some really strong pointers for nonprofit leaders as they think about having these conversations with their various funders. What does it look like to really be thinking about an endowment? And offer here some insights. How do you ask to lead? How do you lead that funding conversation from an endowment perspective?
And Darren, just before you jump into those lessons, I do just want to put a double underline on the point you made about sort of the state of play with what kinds of organizations have endowments. I mean, for me, every time we discuss it, that discrepancy between Howard and Harvard is jarring and sticks in my mind. But, in our research in this piece, we looked at, first of all, this gap between endowments for sort of huge institutions, universities, medical research, et cetera, and social change organizations. We also looked within social change organizations at organizations that are, led by or focused on the Black community, and those that are not. And there was a gap there as well. But the list of entities that are storied and critical, like the NAACP, like organizations that either have no endowment or very modest endowments, is striking. So there's just a sort of an incredible set of leaders and organizations that are ripe and ready today to do greater work with greater financial resource.
100%, William. I think that, remember when we pulled up the research, it's like, wait, the NAACP doesn't have an endowment? Are you kidding me? Right? The Equal Justice Initiative, Community Change, all these organizations that are really just anchors from a social justice perspective that every year have to raise a certain amount of money just to stay open is really problematic on so many levels. So how do we think about using those endowments to even honor those organizations that have been doing the work over decades and generations in a way that's powerful? So just to come back to this idea of advice on how to lead funder conversations, the wording here is really important. It's a question of how do you lead the conversation, right? And I think this is a conversation that nonprofits can lead. First and foremost, I think it's important for folks to understand your worth, have a number in mind, right? And I joke that as you think about creating an endowment campaign, you should know that number the same way you know your mortgage payment every month, the same way you know the price of your cup of coffee at your local Starbucks. This is really having a clear sense of kind of what is the number, and be bold with that number. I encourage people to price with pride. Really think from an abundance mindset, because ultimately you're thinking about the longevity of the work and the thinking and promoting your institution over time. So really have a number, and from a number perspective, I suggest a number that the pull down, so the 5 to 10% that you're taking away from that number should be covering at least half of your organization's annual costs, right? So that's a number from, how do you think about that number itself? The second one is understanding who is in your inner circle. So clearly, as you think about endowment funds, building endowment funds, this is not a conversation you can have with everyone, right? This is not the conversation you're having with the funder that you're fighting with over $10,000 a year, right? With maximum reporting. You should be thinking about who is in your inner circle from a grant maker perspective, the folks that believe in you, that trust you as a funder, as an organization, that have possibly supported you over time, the folks that you can really think about will support you and trust you to carry out your work and believe in you as a long-standing institution. All right, so these are your inner circle from a grant-making perspective. These are folks that you should really target around this work and use them as a starting point in building out this campaign, and actually encircle them in the process in a way that they feel like they have to be supportive of leading it even. The third point is really understanding and articulating, demonstrating your relationship with the community as an asset, right? And so I think this is one where it's really important for organizations to recognize that proximity is an asset. It's your asset. Proximity is power. Proximity is expertise. You have what funders want: a true understanding of the communities that you work with, a clear understanding of the assets that they have that they can leverage, and a demonstrated commitment and relationship with those communities that really, speak to your ability to drive the work in a meaningful and powerful way, but also that speaks, to your strong understanding of their needs and your strategic expertise, right? And so how can you make sure you understand what your connection is to the community, and you're able to articulate that in a way that makes funders recognize that ultimately your relationship with the community is one that should be leveraged and driving impact, and you should be trusted with that relationship. And then finally, and this is one that's a little counterintuitive, particularly for really thoughtful leaders who do the work really well, I think I encourage folks to, for once in their life, think a little selfishly about the work and about the long-term commitments they're making to relationships, to the communities that they serve and the organizations they work within. So really good leaders are always thinking about their community first. Yes, and when leaders put their org first, they will be able to serve that community in an enduring and sustainable way. And so how do you think about supporting your organization? How do you think about success past your tenure at an organization, and your ability to actually create an institution that's going to be sustainable and that exists long past your time there? I'm reminded, and this is Duke Ellington, jazz composer, one of my favorite pieces by his, this beautiful piece called Three Black Kings. It's one that I've known for many years. Alvin Ailey does a wonderful piece to it. And there was, at some point, maybe about a year or so ago, I learned that Duke Ellington actually dictated that piece from his deathbed. He actually never heard the piece performed. He dictated to his son, who then took the piece and ran with it and made probably one of his most beautiful creations after his death, right? And I think it's important for leaders to be thinking about, don't think about your death, since that's not that macabre, right? But as you think about your tenure in an organization, how do you think about what you're dictating now that someone else will have to carry out? As many of us are basically carrying out things that have been dictated long before we got to the organizations as well. So how do we make sure we have institutions and spaces that can carry out that work and that intergenerational work from a thinking community perspective over time? I think it's really powerful and really meaningful for organizations to think about this work and think about success. So those are kind of the four points that I offer folks as they think about success and really developing a conversation. Most importantly, it's really, how do you normalize this? It's just part of what you do as an organization and what success looks like. This is the way that you normalize a building campaign or bring on a CFO or bring on a good programs person. This should be part of your tools of success as you think about your nonprofit and your organization. And once you've normalized that internally, it makes making the case a lot easier with external partners and funders in the work itself. And William, I'm going to turn the question back to you as well. It's a bit of a different context. I do want to encourage folks, we're going to go after you answer this question to a Q&A. So I want to encourage folks to really be putting questions in the Q&A if they would love for some questions for us to talk through. But I would love, the question I have for you is, throwing that question back at you, William, this is the same question, but from a donor perspective. What's the incentive for a donor to think about this from an impact perspective?
Great. Thanks, Darren. And do folks in the session put in Q&A, not in the chat line, but in the Q&A option, any questions you'd love us to touch on today. But from a donor perspective, Darren, despite the fact that it is an unusual way to think about supporting the NGOs that that work on the sort of toughest social change problems, to support NGOs led by leaders of color, to support organizations maybe that aren't quite as well established, there's an enormous amount that meets the underlying and fundamental desires of philanthropists. So first and foremost is this question about civil society. What does it take to build a strong civil society? And one of the the great blessings of American society, but also in countries across the world, is having this third sector, this independent sector, the name of of our sponsoring agent here at Upswell, and that sector doesn't come along by happenstance. And in fact, some of the things that over many decades, even centuries, we've seen philanthropy be most proud of is their enduring legacy. What are the groups that are and work that is set and lasting? And in fact, for philanthropists who are at sort of the back half, let's say, of their giving careers, that sense of having left a permanent and enduring mark tends to be the most rewarding part of their work. And endowments are obviously a vehicle for doing that. The second is to sort of think about some of the dynamics of giving that are most frustrating. So one we touched on before is this question of should our nonprofits be going out of business? Just sort of reframing that to think about creating an enduring institution leads to sort of more reward, if you will, in your giving. And the other, I guess I would say, which we haven't touched on as much, is this trickiness around power dynamics, community voice, et cetera. And there's a very active conversation in the philanthropic community about how to offset these inherent power dynamics. Many philanthropists sincerely want more community voice in their decision-making, want to be in relationships with their grantees that are not dominated by an imbalance of power, but those things are inherently hard, right? We've seen people do it better, we've seen people do it worse, but you can never eliminate it. And even some of the vehicles and approaches for getting community voice into philanthropy decision-making can seem kind of awkward or maybe even artificial and very complicated. And the beauty of endowments is the simplicity with which it addresses those questions, right? When dollars move from one place to the balance sheet of the nonprofit, literally the power itself transfers. The money is the power. And all of a sudden, there's an ability to have a conversation with a leader you believe in, with an organization that's pursuing important, that in which that power dynamic has now been addressed in a way that is otherwise just truly impossible to fully address. And that can be rewarding. So there's a whole bunch of things about, thinking about sort of the deeper long run goals in which we have seen philanthropists feel immensely satisfied giving endowments. And it's not like, Darren, nonprofit leaders are then not interested in taking the phone call. We have never seen a nonprofit leader then say, thank you very much, we're not talking to anymore. If anything, the partnership is deeper and more powerful. And then the final thing I'll just say is this question of portfolio. I don't know that it is. I don't know that it would be the right move for impact for philanthropists to say, hey, the entirety of what we give is now going to be endowments to Black-led organizations or social change organizations or endowments at all, it's not always the right tool for the job. And the notion that it shouldn't be a part of the toolkit, it shouldn't be one segment of the portfolio, is probably never the case. So when we've talked to philanthropists, we see great reward and satisfaction and impact coming from thinking about it as one of the common tools to deploy that should be considered. So that's where I'd leave it, Darren.
No, that's really helpful. And just to throw out a few questions for us to riff on, William, that we often get as we think about this work. I think one of the things that I have people ask all the time is how to not let humility get in the way of the ask. And I think that also speaks to many ways, how do we adopt an abundance mindset within both the philanthropic community, but also within the nonprofit community. And I just have some thoughts here and would love for you to chime on as well where it's helpful.
Yeah, please.
And so one, from a humility perspective, I think that, I encourage folks to think selfishly, and never are you going to hear anyone say that both in the philanthropic space, that there's only certain leaders I encourage to do that. These are folks that clearly understand the work, understand the thinking, understand what impact looks like. And I encourage them to think, really think about their organizations as being enduring institutions. And, the piece that we wrote this, another piece on what we can learn from leaders of color. And what was interesting about one of those learnings was that very often leaders of color understand success takes time, and that so little success actually happens, or the fight isn't fought and completely won within their lifetime, right? It's generational, right? And so I think there's something to be said about how do you think about your role from a generational perspective and creating a legacy and institution that can carry out that work past your generation and your tenure. And so I think there is something to be said about how do you think about your organization and your time at that organization as being a limited amount of time, but your job from a development perspective, your job from an organizational perspective is setting up that organization to be sustainable long after you're there. And I think if you think about that as success, that gives you some space to really think about how you should be developing and creating an institution that's enduring to make sure that you're able to change with time and with the organization or with society as it changes as well, and build on wins as they happen. The other question, I would love to just offer a couple of thoughts, but then throw it to you, William, is really how do endowments fit into this wonderful, nebulous, beautiful world that we call trust-based philanthropy? And for me, I think that endowments fit because they really speak to this ability of a funder to transfer power to those that are closest to the issues and closer to the solutions. Yeah. Love your thoughts there as well, William.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I'll actually, let me offer some thoughts on that and then go in reverse order, because I'd love to also build on your first set of points about, thinking about the generations and time. But on the trust-based philanthropy question, in many ways, endowments, endowments are the sort of the perfect or complete embodiment of trust-based philanthropy, right? So trust-based philanthropy is a big focus of conversation here. We talk about whether, what are the reporting requirements, how restricted are grants, what kind of hoops nonprofits have to go through. And thankfully, I think there's a movement or a growing appreciation in any event of the benefits of giving more trust to the leaders. But literally the transfer of assets from donor to doer is the complete act of trust. And when we've looked at our big bets research, this isn't about endowments specifically, but it's about significant gifts. What we've found is that the biggest gifts, we built a database of $10 million, of essentially all $10 million, publicly known $10 million grants made in the United States over a 14-year period of time. But when you look at those gifts, they're on average the fifth gift that entity has received from the donor, but represent a 10 times growth over the fourth gift, over the most recent previous gift. And what that speaks to in our assessment is trust. And very, very few nonprofit leaders sit down for a lunch with a donor and wow them so much that the donor gives, 7, 8-figure gifts. It just, I mean, it happens, but it happens extraordinarily rarely. What is the more common path is that a donor believes in a nonprofit's cause, believes in the leader, and wants to write a check, but doesn't necessarily see how that leader and that team will change the world. Nor do they really necessarily feel an enormous amount of trust. But when we've seen the big gifts happen on that 4th or 5th commitment, it's a representation of trust. And endowment is just simply the next logical step to sort of fully living into that, living into trust that way, and probably no better way to leave an enduring legacy for the donor. And it's just simple. It's just straight up simple. And we can look at organizations throughout the history of American civil society and see the impact that endowments, in fact, do have. But I also, Darren, wanted to just come back to you on this question of mindset, right? The notion that as a nonprofit leader, nonprofit leaders, thankfully, are almost always focused on the constituents that they're trying to benefit or support, and don't always think about themselves. I would also say that in our conversation about social change issues and in the ways we try and sell things to donors, urgency is a big headline. Think about climate change, think about our democracy, think about our racial reckoning. There is both a depth to the problem and an urgency to the problems that calls on us to act now, and that is true and important. And it's somewhat in conflict with the years it will take to actually create change, as you've said. And so this notion of raising resources for the long run, of the patience to invest in ourselves and our organizations to be strong for the long run, is actually an unnatural act. So I've been involved in a number of endowment campaigns, and I have found in each time a surprising amount of resistance from within the nonprofit organizations themselves, right? Because, if you have dollars to invest and take a small percent of in perpetuity, that's by definition sacrificing some impact today for impact tomorrow. Now, I don't necessarily think that donors are indifferent, right? I don't think that the dollar amount is necessarily the same, $1 today for an endowment or $1 today for Action Today. I think, the possibility of raising endowments makes the full rate potential money raised larger. But I would still say that there has never been a nonprofit leadership team that I've been involved with that does not feel tension about raising money that will not be spent on the urgency of today's problems and will be stewarded for the strength of addressing tomorrow's problems. And that's something for a leadership team to wrestle with. I think just like donors have to get out of the mindset of, a nonprofit should work themselves out of business, nonprofit leadership teams need to sincerely wrestle with the question of whether their work will be done in 3 or 5 years, or whether they actually need to be planning for a longer time horizon. And I think sort of a patient reflection will lead us to say more often than we think we'll need the long run. And for sure, philanthropists won't give the support if nonprofit leaders aren't clear they want that support. And so that's something for all of us as civil society participants to think about.
I think, William, can I build on that point? Because I think there's something really powerful there as well. I was in an event with Javier Torres over at CERDNA some months back, and he talked about various types of nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, and he created a distinction between 2 types. There was a 3rd type, but the most importantly, the first 2. One were those organizations that what he called were like frontline organizations. They were triage organizations. They were literally dealing with issues as they came in. And they were the organizations that were literally fighting the battles with urgency, full and foremost, right? That was kind of thought about the work and the thinking. And then he talked about the second category of organizations, and those were the organizations that were building for the future, the urgency of tomorrow, right? Literally, as we think about the world that we're trying to create, who are the organizations that are going to be leading that work, leading that thinking, right? And how do you think about investing in a way that because we're going to need those organizations, right? As we think about this future world, how we're investing now to make sure those organizations exist and that story is being carried. And so I think that was just a really powerful way of thinking about, the need to really be thinking about the long-term durability of organizations, but also how are we looking at the optimism, the radical optimism of endowments, and thinking about actually creating organizations that are going to be in that future world that we're hoping to create. So I think that was something that was really powerful and something that really sticks out to me, thinking about having both those organizations, those leaders, and funders that are prepared to be laying the groundwork for that work and that thinking as well.
That's great, Darren. Jen has forwarded a question to us about, how as a nonprofit leader do you engage in the conversation with philanthropists to sort of effectively build the trust, to change that, or to shape that mindset that would lead to it. And so Darren, I'll say a couple of things and then maybe ask you to weigh in also on that question. Many of the things are, of course, the things that we all do already, doing great work, investing time in relationships. So a lot of the fundamentals are not surprising. But one dimension that I think can be valuable for nonprofit leaders to think about is how do we frame and define success to our donors? And many times we find that folks overpromise and underdeliver, right? So we frame the problems, we are moved by the magnitude of the problems and then believe that by framing the magnitude as big as possible, as large as possible, we may motivate donors. And often we found that the opposite is true, as opposed to sort of framing problems as big as possible. If we lose this election, the country will no longer be a democracy. If we don't get the carbon emissions commitments that we need in this cycle, the earth will warm too much. That if we frame the problems that large, first of all, we take it to a space that's beyond what we as leaders and organizations actually affect. And two, it can make it seem irrelevant or futile to even act because the problems are baked in. And so by thinking about success in ways that are important and achievable, we can motivate the larger gift. Donors have no shortage of problems that are worthy of addressing, but what they do generally have is a shortage of leaders they believe can deliver what is being discussed. And I'll give an example of, I think, just sort of a wonderful and important achievement, which is ProPublica, the investigative journalism organization. This now goes back a few years, but starting a decade or so ago, the newspaper model, basically economic model of newspapers, basically fell apart, and fewer and fewer newspapers had any kind of serious journalism staffs doing investigative reporting. And ProPublica, which was funded by the Sandler family, came into existence to essentially be a new model, to be a philanthropy-backed model for having a shop of serious investigative journalists. They've won all kinds of Pulitzer Prizes. But the promise, if you will, of ProPublica wasn't to reverse the trend of all newspapers in America or to solve the critical role of a free press in our society. It wasn't that big, but it was to say we are going to create a successful and enduring new model for how journalism can be done. And that was a goal that was meaningful enough to merit very significant investment, but also modest enough to actually be achieved. And today, ProPublica continues to be this incredible pillar of our society. And so that's just an example of thinking about sort of how to navigate the conversations with donors and to think very clearly, strategically about what it is that we're doing. But Darren, I'd love your reflections on that.
No, I think that your point there is a really clear one and compelling one. I think that for me, I remind my teams all the time, as we think about this work, as we think about impact, as we think about success, we're in a country of narratives. We're Americans, right? That's literally, we're a country of stories and narratives. And ultimately, I think that very often the easiest way to disrupt a broken narrative is by telling a more compelling and beautiful one. Right. And so I think that very often our work becomes, what is the narrative? What's the story that we're telling? And what are we building? Right. I think that a lot of this work is about deconstructing things, but a lot of these things are about building things as well. And I think that funders really get excited about, as we all do, the narrative around what we're building, what we're putting together, what will take time to create, what is that a response to? Yes, but and more importantly, how is it envisioning a new world, a new way of thinking? And so I think your ability as an organization leader to really be painting a picture of what you're creating with your work, the time frame for that work and success, and really how you envision a new world becomes really important. And funders really get excited about that work. I think that, I joke all the time that, from a guilt perspective, people like to use guilt as a way of getting funding. Guilt definitely works from the short-term perspective, but not from a long-term perspective, right? And so as you're thinking about actually having sustainable funding that can drive the work and the thinking, I think it's important for you to be thinking about how you're putting forth a new vision of the world, a new vision of the issue, and really how you're bringing in community voice and elevating voices to make that vision possible. And so I think that that's really key to winning over funders, having them along on the journey, and giving them a place in that what you're creating becomes really important as well. So,
Darren, that's both so true and so beautifully stated. Maybe that brings us to a logical point to wrap up with both some concluding thoughts, and then I think also we'll put in the chat links to our publication and some other.
Yeah, we have some slides here. So we'll definitely be using those for folks as they need them. So really encouraging folks to stay connected. Once again, this is all part of Bridgespan's work. We take our role in producing great knowledge that can be shareable. We take it all very seriously. And so really publications at bridgespan.org, our newsletters, just checking us out at the Bridgespan group itself, link also on social media. I joke, William, that after one of our articles were released, I was reading in the comments and someone said, "Oh my God, I've been saying this for years. Thank you, Bridgespan, for bringing the receipts." So I love being in the receipts making business. I encourage folks to encourage us to help us stay in that position as well. And on the second slide there, just really want to thank each of you for the work that you do within the sector itself. I have a closing quote. Rishi Vade, who was a friend and a mentor we lost some few months back, but she left us with the quote: "Those of us who are running towards liberation, towards a vision of a different social and economic order, we are one team, running a relay race together, handing the baton back and forth to each other all the time. It's in our collective that we find our strength and purpose. It's in our collective that the race is won." So a huge gratitude to you, William, to all the folks who joined this session, and all the folks at Upswell and others who are supporting this work and are running the relay race with us. Thank you, each of you.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Upswell community.